welcome everyone to our panel. I'm Svea FINA, and before introducing my wonderful guest to you, I would love to introduce myself, that you know who's guiding you through this conversation today. I'm Svea FINA, founder and managing director of FINA.DIGITAL. We are a New York City-based online marketing agency. We have a strong presence in the US as well as in Europe, and we do everything from strategic narratives, content production, as well as online marketing. We have a proven track record in building leading brands as well in marketing them. So we have a proven track record, and we help brands as well as founders successfully launching their businesses, grow and expand, especially in between like the US and the European market. In addition, we are dedicated to educate about the environmental challenges of our time. This is why we support clients with their sustainability goals. The goal is a net positive approach, where we will talk about today, through communication, education, and innovation. Sustainability is not just a professional commitment. It's, for me, deeply value and purpose-driven. As an advisor and also investor for leading impact funds, I aim to make a meaningful impact to create a more sustainable future. So happy to guide you through the conversation and introduce you to my wonderful guests. Starting with ladies first, Nadine Quambusch, a partnerships manager at Climework. Nadine has a strong wish to dedicate her time and energy to fighting climate change. She joined Climework in early 2022. She's responsible for the development of partnerships that aim to educate and inspire others about Climework's carbon removal technology. Good to have you here, Nadine.
Thank you, Svea.
And there we have Magnus, CEO of CEEZER. Magnus is the founder and CEO of CEEZER, a platform for corporates to access and manage negative emissions credits based on science-backed data. He supports large-scale transformation and climate strategies for enterprises across the technology and industrial sector at BCG. Welcome, Magnus.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. We have Ralf, managing director of naturamus. Ralf Kunert has been managing director of naturamus since 2014. Together with his colleague, he discovers and buys high-quality organic raw materials all over the world. For him, it's all about protecting the earth and empowering people. Happy to have you here, Ralf.
Thank you.
And there we have Daniël Besselink. Daniël has a background in public and business administration and worked previously for an impact measurement startup. At Neocarbon, Daniël develops partnerships with carbon credit buyers, sequestration companies, and CO2 utilizing companies. So, my first question, starting with Magnus, how can businesses effectively integrate impact within their operation and supply chain to create a net positive impact? We talked about this before.
Sure.
And I loved your answer.
Of course. I mean, it's a very broad question, so I hope we have the full time of the panel to actually discuss that. What I'm definitely happy to give a bit of color to is, I think, how we work with our customers on helping them integrate more the carbon and climate angle into it. And I think essentially large corporations always have like the same three essential things that they need to manage, which is, first of all, you need to measure your emissions, you need to understand what your footprint is, you need then to start to reduce it internally, you need to start then thinking about insetting, can you use stuff in your supply chain to actually reduce it further, and then ultimately for the remaining carbon emissions that you have, what can you do to get these out again of the atmosphere, essentially remove them, right? Or if you can't remove them, to kind of compensate in the meantime. And I think we always look at it from kind of budgetary perspective. So clearly no company has an unlimited budget. So you're kind of drawing from almost like the same pot, and you need to then optimize what you can do best. Like, what's the angle for you where you will be the most effective, right? And I think especially if you decide between, what can you do internally, clearly that should always be the priority. I think no question around it. So internal carbon reduction is something that's always worth your first investment in a sense. But then if you have to decide between insetting and offsetting, for example, there are a lot of trade-offs you have to make. And what we do, and what we ultimately also help to do for corporates on our platform, is to actually help get a science-backed and data-backed understanding about, like, what's our competitive advantage, right? I think we will probably hear from you a bit about what you can do within your supply chain. And there is a lot of companies that can do a lot, but there's also companies that are not able to actually leverage their supply chain for carbon removal or for insetting activities. And then often it can be the more cost-effective and impact-effective way to look for solutions that are outside, right? And I think ultimately, we always think you have to do the full way. You have to do all three things, ideally. Clearly, there's a more urgency on the reduction. That said, we're also very much behind. So I think, from our perspective, it's not an either-or discussion anymore. It's really about like what can you do to what degree at what point in time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for helping me hosting this panel. So I would love to ask Ralf exactly that question. I mean, you as a foundation, as a Vala Foundation, have it deeply in your roots to build sustainable businesses. And when it comes to raw materials and supply chain, we would love to hear what you're doing actually already for some years and what is your long-term vision.
Yeah, as you mentioned, we have the big advantage that we are not a stock exchange company, so we have our ownership is a foundation, so we can really think in long periods. And our idea from the beginning is to work in a very sustainable way. So in sense of raw materials, we prefer organic and biodynamic raw materials since a long time. Dr. Hauschka, it's nearly 19 years old. So we have a long experience about this topic. And of course, we are sourcing also from all over the world. And our idea is, as we have also CO2 output, or it's a question how you define it, but even we have to compensate. And our idea is to create positive CO2 positive raw materials. So really to try not only to not produce CO2, but also to store the CO2 in the soil. And there is a nice approach about biochar with coal and composting. And on this way, we try to solve this problem for us in the future. And we have a first trial in Kenya with macadamia nuts, with shelves we are burning to produce coal and to produce energy. And so it's the first step to this climate positive raw materials.
Super interesting. Nadine, you work for Climeworks and are responsible for the partnerships. Like, in what kind of stage the partners, team up with you, and with what kind of challenges they're facing, and how do you help them?
Before I start talking about that, I want to tell everyone what direct air capture is, because I think it's quite novel and maybe unknown to some of you. Direct air capture is a technology where we draw carbon directly out of the atmosphere with very, very big fans, as you can imagine them. You can Google it afterwards. We draw the carbon out. We then give it to our partner, where we do it in Iceland with Carbfix, and store it underground. And we store it underground because that's where we can store it very safely and permanently, so that the risk of reversal of the emissions going back into the atmosphere is close to zero. So this first to the technology. And why do we exist? We exist because nature can't do it alone anymore. When you read the reports from the IPCC, you see the challenge has become too big. It doesn't matter how effective and successful we become with our nature-based solutions, there's a natural limit to them. So technology is really there to safeguard what we achieve on that side and add to it, extend it, and go hand in hand, really. So nature and technology is both needed. And when we work with companies, one of our recent very great deals was with JP Morgan. Our technology is there for unavoidable emissions, so emissions we cannot possibly reduce in any way, and also historical emissions. We're currently emitting 50 billion tons per year, and each ton is too much already. So all of this has to come back down, has to be brought back down by nature-based and tech-based approaches. And again, nature won't be enough, so direct air capture, but also approaches like Ralf mentioned, biochar, really need to receive more support from the industry and need to be scaled up immediately. As policy is a little bit behind on this topic, the industry is really the ones that can make an influence, that can make an impact by entering large partnership deals with companies like us.
Thank you. Daniel, how can businesses address impact areas that are far from their value chain but still require mitigation? What are the most effective measures beyond the supply chain from your perspective?
So I think, to answer that, I think indeed companies first have to reduce their emissions as much as possible in their own value chain. But that would, of course, won't be sufficient, as was said already. So we need to remove the final part of those emissions. And then we really have to look into new technologies that remove the final part to truly become net zero. And then you can look into solutions like biochar, but also direct air capture. And maybe to also give a brief introduction about who I am and our company. So I'm from Neocarbon, and we develop also direct air capture technology. And what we specifically do is we retrofit cooling towers to perform direct air capture. So one of the problems with direct air capture is that it's currently way too expensive to become economically viable. And as said, you basically need gigantic fans, you need a lot of heat. And basically by leveraging the cooling tower, you don't have to create a fan because it's already there, and you can leverage their heat. And that is kind of our approach to decrease the cost of direct air capture and really make it at scale happen. And that's why we also basically target industries to also use their own infrastructure to use their own supply chain to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's mostly you reduce your emissions in your supply chain and then you offset the rest. But with our technology, because you leverage your own infrastructure like cooling towers, you can really remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And what's interesting, what Ralf was already saying, is indeed we are also partnering up now with a company that stores CO2 into concrete. And what's actually interesting about that is the more concrete you build, the better it is for the environment. So that's also an interesting way of thinking. And we always say we need to do less, and in certain situations I think that's very true. But with large-scale innovation, like using direct air capture for concrete, storing it permanently, even if the house breaks down, you can really also increase economical growth with also doing good for the environment.
I think what we can all agree is like that we still need a lot more conversation about this kind of topic. What we can really do with innovation, and what really is the beauty about innovation, that it's like often just a positive side effect to have like carbon reductions if you use it right. We talked about transparency in the market and then lack of transparency, and also about like companies really suffering about like doing something and then they proactively do something and in the end it doesn't make any impact. Could you just explain a bit more how you see the projects and the companies you work together, and if you see it more holistic or like case to case?
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, I think it also goes to show all of the points that we just discussed, right? I think there are certain companies can do certain things better on their own, right? So if you have a strong agricultural supply chain, you're definitely able to work more with agricultural suppliers. If you JP Morgan, there's little you can do for direct air capture out of your operations, right? So I think we have to go a bit away from the approach to say you should only do stuff within your supply chain, and I think we definitely see here and there the trend of companies being very quick to say, we're just going to do insetting, we're just going to plant our own forest next to our plant, which quite honestly is often like less regulated. You have often less measurement data, so you're kind of replicating quality concerns that have been around the carbon market for 20 years. So suddenly you move it out of a by far not perfect system into a completely unmonitored system, right? And there is no guidance on insetting, so the definition isn't even clear, right? There's not even clear what you could account it for. So I think everyone kind of needs to be a bit careful to think about what is stuff that strategically makes sense for me, where I do have my strength, right? This I should probably do, and that I have a sense of operation, I have the ability to measure impact, I have the ability to report on this. And where is it more efficiently for me to maybe focus on decarbonization, but at the same time take the remainder of budget that you might have to work with direct air capture companies, for example, right? Or any other, I think, company. And it's almost, to me, I mean, if you look at it from a very holistic perspective, it's almost like a very traditional make or buy decision, right? Like there are certain things you can do yourself, which you should do yourself, and there are certain things and solutions that are probably better had to be purchased from somewhere else, right? And if you purchase from somewhere else, you do have the advantage that often there is more data in there because there is a contract that you have a liability against, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just a bit more standardization happening, and ultimately, we will need all of it, right? So what we will need to do is kind of factor out what is the best approach, and that's very individual for every company, depending on what their operations look like and what their capabilities look like. Yeah.
Super interesting. Ralf, we were just talking about how important it is to, use the best tools to have to create transparency, to have meaning deep insights about, what makes sense, what is really in the end like net positive. What are you doing, with like a foundation, with a very holistic approach, like a very, the mindset of a company who is very nature oriented? How do you manage to implement like the best digital tools to create transparency, to really have an innovative approach there as well?
That's really a quite big topic, and we tried different solutions, and it's not as easy, because if you think about the supply chain and if you really want to have good data, then it's really nearly impossible, because you get two figures from two different companies, from two different suppliers, and they will not fit together. So I think I totally agree to Magnus that it's really complicated, that we are not really know too much and too exactly how much impact we really have. So that it's really still a topic. And I would like to discuss with Magnus afterwards if we can work together in this topic, because that's a different, difficult topic. But of course we calculate, and there are topics which are easy to calculate, like transportation. If we think about agriculture production, then it becomes really difficult, because it's depending from the farming system, it becomes different from the climate situation, and there are not too much figures available.
But on the other hand, as I can imagine, like you were like a pioneer in this kind of area, you are much better ahead than a lot of companies, and it's quite a big unfair advantage, right?
Yeah, we try to be.
Yeah.
Of course. Therefore, you see, we are discussing with the Öko Institute and with other institutions to discuss about the topics, but it's not as easy, because, and you have to take in mind that if we talk about nature, it's not an industry. And in the soil, for example, you have different processes which are not the same in wintertime and in summertime. And the carbon content, the humus content in the soil, it's not the same all over the year. So it's really an interesting topic and a research topic where we have to work in to learn more about it. And therefore, it's not as easy as like in a factory where you know exactly how much CO2 it's get off. In a field, it's not as easy. But we are working on, there are different initiatives in agriculture from FIBEL in Switzerland, for example. We are working with them. But it's not easy for all situations, and we have more than 250 suppliers to get the real data from each one.
We talked initially when we were connecting and preparing this panel about like insetting, offsetting, and you were all like, okay, I don't want to answer the insetting question. What is really about that? So I would just give you the option to decide who wants to. Nadine or Daniel, go for it.
I'll skip this one.
Okay, let's go to the next one. What do you think is like the most, what makes the most impact for the future? Nadine, we talked about that education is so important, and communication right now about like sustainability action, what makes really sense, about the right tools, about like how to really address it. Of course, like depends on what kind of industry you are. Like a tech company is a different thing than like a producing company. You worked before at Bayersdorf, so you have a deep knowledge about like good communication strategies. What are you doing at your current role that really drives the education and communication change and impact?
A big question. First of all, the big difference is, of course, that I used to talk to consumers, and now I'm very much addressing corporates and C-level. And that's
Are they open to talk about it? In a very...
Not always. And I think that's one of the biggest issues, the openness to listen, to just have a conversation. We don't immediately need to talk about numbers and deals and what are we going to do, but let's just have a conversation. Tell me what your challenges are internally. What challenges do you have in terms of pricing, your budgets? How can we together maybe define a roadmap to tackle all of that? Because in the end, every company will have unavoidable emissions they can't deal with. And with really only a few of them, we see that they've thought so far into the future, they calculated back and said, okay, we know that by 2050 we need to remove X tons of CO2, and we cannot do it right now. There is no supply. We have a huge supply shortage on CO2 removal. So they know I need to start working with these companies now, like Climework or like Neocarbon. But that's not very often the case, and it's really currently pioneering companies with very futuristic mindsets that do that, and it needs to become something normal for everyone.
Are you thinking that, like, I don't know, C-level big companies, but also like B2B, but also consumers are just like overwhelmed from the like kind of approach? So many platforms for like reducing carbon. Like, is it also not for the consumer and the companies itself very hard to really have transparency, who is really making an impact and who's just like making a profitable business case? Daniel?
Yeah, I think in general, as such a new market is developing, there are a lot of new players around, there are a lot of new knowledge, but
Let's.
that will work too. All right, so let's. No. It's back. It's back. So I don't have to scream again. So what I was saying is, yes, indeed. I think in every new market, when there are so many new things developing, you see a lot about carbon offsets, insets, carbon removal, carbon avoidance. All that kind of buzzwords are developing. And I think one of the things that really help this industry forward is if we kind of, although it's relatively difficult, but use the same kind of wording for everything. So if we talk about methodologies or we talk about verification or what that means, and I think also that regulation can help a lot with that we also speak the same language, so to speak. And then if you talk to corporates or to methodology providers, that everyone speaks the same level, and that I think would also really help to increase the kind of transparency of the market, because we know it's such a new market, and some people say like, okay, yeah, but if you focus on removal, then you won't reduce your own emissions and this and that. And I think that it's a lot about transparency and about education, so really showing like, okay, even if we're a direct air capture company, we won't say that you need to reduce your emissions. We say to every company we speak to, first reduce your emissions, and then for the final part, start removing your CO2, because you won't get to net zero without removing your CO2. But like offsetting all your emissions with carbon removal, that will never fly. So we need both. And for that, you need to have very clear language on what that means. And I think if every company in the world would know what kind of the strategy is, that this market would develop also way faster than it's today. If we look at how much we need to develop in the years ahead, it's a really tough schedule, and we need to reach it because, well, we can see the first consequences of climate change already in our society. But yeah, then transparency and common language would really help.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Because I think, maybe just like, because I think from my perspective, I think it should be a B2B topic. I don't think it should be put on the consumer, right? I think it's absurd to say that the entities that produce most of the emissions, and they're actually in control around like how big your footprint is, right? Where the bulk of the emissions actually is happening. This is also the most feasible way and the best access point to actually start to think about what's the responsibility around it, right? There's still ways to monetize this from a B2C perspective. There's still ways to refinance. There's still ways to market it. But I think it's also kind of I think it's a really kind of weird discussion to always say, shouldn't consumers do X, Y, Z, right? I think we ask companies to reduce scope 1 and 2 first and then think about scope 3. For consumers, most of their emissions are scope 3 in a sense, right? It's goods that they buy, services that they get from companies, and it's companies that have a easier way to actually adjust this, right? And I think maybe just to your point as well on like how to actually get companies to do it, I do think that data helps actually a lot. So while it's good to have a good conversation in the beginning, but I think if we make it transparent, right? If you have some data behind it, if you can communicate drawbacks based on verified information, it becomes a very different, less emotional, and maybe also less black and white discussion, because you're starting to understand trade-offs, and you can actually start to optimize between those trade-offs, which I think is something that's very much natural to most boards and most CEOs in the world, is to actually do this every day, right? So you can kind of translate it a bit more into a language that I think also works within a governance system of global corporations, ultimately.
Good point. I think as we're coming closely, like shortly to the end, I would love to ask you all a last question. What do you think is a biggest opportunity, but also challenge right now? What do you think, like, if you could make a wish, like today, you know, what would you change? Is it more like stricter regulation? Is more like consciousness, more listening, more awareness of sea level, of the market itself, what of the consumers? Like, what do you think should change? First of all, if you could make a wish and think that would make the biggest impact. Nadine.
I have many wishes. One of the bigger ones would be that we move away from a voluntary carbon market. That would already help many of us if it would be regulated by law for companies to offset certain amounts of CO2 using both reduction measures and removal measures. We, of course, have the SBTI that says we need to reduce by 90%, remove up to 10% maximum, but this is voluntary. Just a few companies are doing that now. I think it's 2,000, which is already great that they are. But everyone else can decide if they want to or not. And it shouldn't be a decision up to 10 people in the boardroom anymore. It needs to become a must.
I can go next. For me, the biggest wish would be that every company would kind of have an honest decision internally and really start measuring how much they actually emit and make like a really good roadmap on how to get to net zero. So really start with reducing your emissions, but also have a clear strategy on how you really get to net zero and not having the remaining 10% still emitting in the atmosphere, because we just cannot afford that. So really have this clear timeline on how you get to net zero with really clear actions on what I need to do in which year and actually live up to it. Instead of we see some companies saying now, okay, I want to be net zero in 2050. And they said, how you achieve it? And it's like, we're figuring it out. And I was like, yes, it's a large topic. But on the other hand, we need clear roadmaps, because with only points further ahead in future, it may be too late.
Yeah, I would agree, Nadine. And we have seen in other topics, in the social topics, we have seen how much changed the supply chain law, the thinking of the companies. And therefore, I totally agree. And I think it would be very helpful if we are thinking, wow, in 5 years, we are talking about a supply chain law about CO2 emissions. And you are responsible for all the CO2 emissions which are within the supply chain. I think that it's an approach. And if it's possible for the companies to calculate what is coming in the future, I think that it's something which is needed, that the people and the companies know. I totally agree, it's a B2B business. If they know what they have to expect and they can prepare, then they will go to the right direction.
Your perspective?
Okay, I mean, agreeing with everything that was said, but I think maybe a very kind of frugal look at it, basically. I think we have a multi-trillion-dollar investment need into decarbonization over the next 20 to 30 years, right? And I feel at this stage, we're not necessarily investing in the best possible buckets, right? Sometimes because we don't know yet, and that's a very honest and kind of sincere reason not to invest in the right bucket. But then there's also sometimes because it's just easier to do something else instead. And I think if we were able to move the investment to the best possible thing based on current knowledge, right, which might change in 5 years, et cetera, we'd already take a big step. Because I think we don't really have money or time left to basically support the wrong ways. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the great conversation. Thank you so much for your honesty and like your really goal to talk in a very straightforward way. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a wonderful further conference and a lovely day in Berlin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.